The clinking of champagne glasses hushed the chatter in the hall. My son's wedding. His big day had been perfect until the moment my ex-husband stood up. He raised his glass high, his voice booming, dripping with arrogance. "This family," he declared, staring straight at me, "owes me everything. Without me, none of this would even exist." The room fell into stunned silence. My son's smile faltered. My daughter-in-law's eyes widened. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, whispers breaking like ripples through water. I felt the familiar burn in my chest, the same humiliation I'd endured for years before finally leaving him. But this was worse. He had chosen this day, this moment, to remind everyone of his supposed dominance, to drag the spotlight from my son's joy back onto himself. And just as I rose to answer, ready to finally cut him down in front of everyone, the doors at the back of the hall opened. My new husband stepped inside his presence, commanding his timing perfect. He walked straight toward me, eyes locked on mine, carrying the truth that would shatter my ex's smug declaration. Because the man who thought we owed him everything was about to learn that he was the one who had lost it all. The moment my new husband appeared in the doorway, heads turned and whispers rose like a tide. I could see the flicker of confusion in my ex's eyes just for a second before he masked it with that same smug smirk I had once mistaken for confidence. But before we get to that moment, let me take you back. My name is Marissa, and for most of my adult life, I played the role of the dutiful wife and mother. I had married young, far too young, believing the world was exactly as my ex-husband Richard told me it was. He was charming, then successful in a small but growing business, and he had a way of making me feel like I was the lucky one to be chosen. At first, I believed his promises. He said he would give me a life of comfort, that I didn't need to finish my degree, that staying home to raise our children would be our investment in the future. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to be the wife who kept the home perfect, who raised the children into model citizens, who always smiled no matter how tired she was. But slowly his promises soured. Richard began to change, or maybe he had always been this way, and I simply hadn't seen it. He became controlling in the smallest ways, the way I cooked, the clothes I wore, even how I spoke in front of his colleagues. He would put an arm around me at parties, smiling broadly, but his fingers would dig into my side whenever he thought I said something that embarrassed him. And money, oh money, was always his favorite weapon. Every dollar that passed through our home was his, he insisted, because he worked for it. It didn't matter that I raised our children, kept our home running, and quietly gave up every dream I had once nurtured. In his eyes, my work wasn't real. My sacrifices were invisible. I remember one night after our daughter's piano recital, I overheard him tell another parent, "Of course she's talented. She got that from me. Everything they are is because of me." He gestured to our children like they were trophies on his shelf. I swallowed my anger then, because that's what I always did. I told myself not to rock the boat, not to ruin the evening. But cracks were forming. By the time our children were in high school, his arrogance had curdled into cruelty. He belittled me in front of them, made jokes at my expense, reminded everyone at family gatherings that without his money, none of us would survive. And for years I endured it because I thought that was what love meant, bearing the pain for the sake of the family. It wasn't until our 20th anniversary that the final straw broke. He had booked a lavish dinner at an upscale restaurant full of people we knew. In the middle of the meal, he raised his glass and said, "Here's to me." Because without me, Marissa wouldn't even exist as she does now. I built this life, I made this family. She's just lucky I chose her. The laughter from his friends burned in my ears. I smiled weakly, my hands trembling under the table, but inside something snapped. For the first time, I didn't feel small. I felt angry. I felt awake. That night, when we returned home, I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the woman staring back. Her eyes were hollow, her shoulders bent, And I made a silent vow I would not let this man define me anymore. The divorce was brutal, of course. Richard fought it with every trick he knew, stalling, hiding money, turning our children against me. But I had finally learned to fight back. And slowly, painfully, I began to rebuild. At first, it was terrifying. I hadn't worked in decades. My skills were outdated. I had no degree, no financial independence, and no clear path forward. But I had something Richard never understood: resilience. I started small part-time work at a local firm, long nights retraining myself in the skills I had once abandoned. The kids were supportive, though confused. They saw me struggle, but they also saw me persevere. And over time, something shifted. They stopped seeing me as just mom who stayed home and started seeing me as a woman who is rediscovering her own worth. It was during this time that I met David. He wasn't flashy like Richard, not the kind of man who needed to dominate every conversation. He listened, really listened. He asked about my dreams, my regrets, the parts of me I had hidden away. And slowly, with patience, he showed me that love didn't have to be control. It could be partnership. When he proposed, it wasn't with a grand gesture or a crowd of people. It was in the quiet of my kitchen with the kids asleep upstairs and takeout containers still on the counter. "Marissa," he said, holding out the simplest ring, "I don't want to build a life that makes you smaller. I want one where we both can grow." I cried that night, not because I was overwhelmed, but because for the first time I felt chosen for who I was, not what I could sacrifice. Now, standing in that wedding hall on my son's big day, I thought about all of it. About the girl I had been, the woman I had become, and the man at the back of the room who had stood beside me through it all. Richard thought this family owed him everything, but he was about to learn the truth: we owed him nothing. And when David walked toward me, strong and steady, ready to stand by my side in front of everyone, I knew this was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment to reclaim my voice and finally put Richard in his place. The sound of my new husband's shoes against the marble floor echoed like a drumbeat, steady and deliberate, as he moved down the aisle of the reception hall. All eyes darted between David and Richard, the contrast between the two men, almost cinematic: one radiating calm assurance, the other puffed up with bravado and bluster. But before David reached me, Richard's voice rose again. "Don't look so shocked," he said, turning his glass toward the crowd. "This entire wedding, this entire family, everything you see here exists because of me. I built this family. I provided for them. Without me, Marissa would still be nothing. Without me, these children wouldn't even know what success looks like." My son, the groom, shifted uncomfortably. His new wife squeezed his hand, her eyes wide with embarrassment. The guests exchanged uneasy glances, whispers rolling across the tables. Some of Richard's old friends nodded along, but others looked away, ashamed for him. And then Richard leaned in, eyes narrowing at me, and delivered the blow he had clearly been waiting years to unleash. "You can play house with your new husband all you want," he sneered. "But let's not forget who paid for your son's education, who funded every private school, every extracurricular, every opportunity that brought him here. Me. And now you'll all sit here and pretend this day is yours, when in reality this family will always owe me." My breath caught in my chest. For a moment, I felt the old shame creep back in that helpless, shrinking sensation I used to feel whenever he cornered me with his cruel truths. But then I noticed something I hadn't seen before. My son was no longer looking at his father with admiration. He was glaring. And then he spoke. "Dad," he said, his voice steady but sharp, "you didn't pay for my education. Mom did." The room stilled. Richard blinked, confused. "What are you talking about? I paid for everything. I worked for everything." My son shook his head, his jaw clenched. "No. Mom covered my tuition after you walked out. You didn't even know, did you? She picked up extra shifts, worked herself sick, and still showed up to every game, every recital. You never even asked how it got paid. You just assumed it was you." Gasps rippled through the crowd. My daughter, who had been silent until now, rose from her seat. He's right. Mom sold her jewelry, Dad. She gave up vacations, nights out, even new clothes just so we wouldn't feel the difference when you were gone. Everything we are, it's because of her, not you. Richard's face flushed crimson. He stammered, his grip tightening on his champagne glass until it trembled. That's not true. But I could see it in his eyes. He hadn't known. He had been so consumed with himself, so eager to believe in his own myth, that he had never once questioned where the money came from after the divorce. David finally reached my side, then his presence like a shield. He placed a hand on my shoulder, steady and sure, and looked Richard directly in the eye. "You're right about one thing, Richard," he said, his voice calm but cutting. "This family owes someone everything. But it's not you." He took my hand and raised it gently, as though presenting me to the entire room. "It's her, Marissa. She is the one who sacrificed. She is the one who built a life for her children after you left. And unlike you, she never demanded gratitude in return." The applause began softly, just a few guests clapping, unsure. But then it grew louder, spreading across the room like wildfire until nearly everyone was on their feet. The sound drowned out Richard's sputtering, his protest swallowed by a chorus of support that wasn't his anymore. And yet, even in that moment of vindication, a part of me reeled. Because as much as I wanted to bask in the truth finally being spoken aloud, I couldn't ignore the darker reality that had just been exposed. Richard's betrayal hadn't ended when he left our marriage. It had continued in silence, in his refusal to see, in his arrogant rewriting of history where only he mattered. He had stolen not just my years but my story, and now in front of everyone I was reclaiming it. But Richard wasn't finished. His eyes, glassy with rage, locked onto mine. "You think this changes anything?" he spat. "You can't erase me. I'll always be the one who started this family. You'll never escape that." For the first time, I didn't flinch. I lifted my chin, my hand still in David's, and let the words roll off me like water. "No, Richard," I said, my voice clear and unwavering. "I'll never erase you, but I'll never owe you again." And in that moment, with my children standing tall beside me and my new husband anchoring me, I knew the tide had finally turned. After the wedding ended, the chatter about Richard's outburst still buzzed like static in the air. Guests tried to brush it off, some whispered behind cupped hands, others approached me quietly to say, "You didn't deserve that." But I didn't need their pity. I didn't want it. What I wanted was balanced justice. Richard had spent decades painting himself as the architect of our family's success, rewriting history in his favor, and then humiliating me on the most important day of our son's life. He thought he had won the moment he stood up with his glass, but the truth had begun unraveling his story in front of everyone. Still, I knew Richard. He wasn't going to fade quietly. The man thrived on dominance, on control, which meant if I wanted to be free, truly free, I couldn't just defend myself from his version of reality. I had to dismantle it, publicly. That night, as David and I sat in our hotel room overlooking the city lights, I laid it out. "I can't let him keep doing this," I whispered. "He'll twist this day into his story. He'll tell people we embarrassed him, that the kids are ungrateful, that I lied. It will never end." David studied me with that steady, unwavering gaze of his. "So what's your plan?" I swallowed because the truth was I'd already been thinking about it. "I want to take back the narrative. He thrives on reputation, on people believing his version of events. If I take that from him, he has nothing." David leaned back, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Then let's do it." And so the planning began. Step one was gathering proof. Over the years, I had kept records, bank statements, receipts, documents from the divorce, even letters from our children's schools that had been addressed only to me. At the time, it had been out of necessity, a way to keep myself organized as I juggled everything he left behind. But now those papers were weapons. Each line of ink was evidence of who had truly carried this family after Richard left. Each zero on those tuition checks signed in my name told the real story. Step two was my children. I didn't want to drag them into a war, but they had already stood up once, and their voices carried weight. I sat them down at the kitchen table a week later, nervous about how they would respond. "I don't want to put you in the middle of this," I began carefully, "but I'm planning to show your father for who he really is. Not with anger, with facts. And I need to know if you'll stand with me." My son glanced at his wife, then back at me. His jaw tightened. "Mom, after what he did at my wedding? You don't even have to ask. I'm with you." My daughter nodded, fire in her eyes. "He's been rewriting our lives for years. It's about time people heard the truth." I felt tears sting my eyes, but this time they weren't from weakness. They were from strength. The kind of strength I had only dreamed of years ago, back when Richard's voice drowned mine out at every turn. Step 3 was timing. If Richard valued one thing above all, it was his reputation among his peers. Business associates, old friends, the country club circle he adored. He wore their admiration like armor, which made the upcoming charity gala, an event he attended every year, the perfect stage. The irony wasn't lost on me. The gala's theme that year was legacy. Richard loved to brag about legacies. He never realized the legacy he had built was one of arrogance, absence, and lies. I arranged to attend with David and my children. But not quietly. With my lawyer's help, I compiled a dossier, a sleek, professional-looking portfolio filled with carefully selected documents and testimonies. Not emotional rants, not accusations, just undeniable facts. The tuition receipts, the property sale documents, the hospital bills I had paid alone when our daughter needed surgery, even the thank you letters from teachers and mentors addressed to me acknowledging my involvement. Facts lined up like dominoes ready to fall. David raised an eyebrow when I showed him. "You're not just confronting him, you're dismantling him." I closed the folder with a snap. He wanted the world to believe everything was because of him. I'm going to show them it was in spite of him. The night of the gala, I dressed with deliberate precision. A deep emerald gown, the kind that made me feel powerful, not hidden. My daughter whispered, "You look like royalty," as she zipped me up. Richard was already there when we arrived, holding court at the bar, his booming laugh filling the room. He hadn't seen me yet, but when he did, his smile faltered, just for a second. Then he lifted his glass and smirked like he already knew he'd win whatever game I thought I was playing. But this time the rules weren't his. As the speeches began, the MC invited a few guests to share thoughts on legacy. I could see Richard fidgeting, waiting for his turn to boast about his empire. And then when the microphone passed my way, I stood. My hands didn't shake, my voice didn't waver. "I want to speak about what legacy really means," I said, scanning the crowd. "It isn't about wealth. It isn't about power. Legacy is about sacrifice, about the unseen labor, the invisible resilience, the quiet determination that keeps families alive when everything else falls apart." Eyes turned toward me. Richard's smirk thinned. I gestured to my children seated proudly beside David. "This family's legacy isn't built on arrogance or control. It's built on love, sacrifice, and truth." Then calmly, I opened the portfolio and began to read, line after line, fact after fact. Not bitter words, just undeniable proof. The crowd murmured, shifting their gazes, snapping toward Richard. His face reddened, his jaw tightening with every document I cited. By the time I closed the folder, the silence in the room was deafening. And then the applause began, soft at first, then swelling until the room was alive with it. Not for Richard. For me. For the truth. Richard stood frozen, his glass forgotten in his hand. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. His story had finally been taken from him, stripped bare in front of the very people he had tried to impress. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to, because the sweetest revenge wasn't watching him stumble. It was standing tall, reclaiming my story, and knowing the world finally saw me, not as his shadow, not as his dependent, but as the woman who had carried everything he abandoned. And yet deep down, I knew there was more. That Richard's reaction, his silence, wasn't just humiliation. It was fear. because the truth I had revealed that night was only part of what he had been hiding. The real secret, the one that would shake everything even more, was still waiting to be uncovered. And when it came, it wouldn't just end his story, it would rewrite mine forever. The morning after, the gala sunlight poured through my kitchen like a benediction. My phone buzzed with messages, old friends I hadn't heard from in years, colleagues who had quietly watched me rebuild, even a few of Richard's acquaintances who wrote some version of "I didn't know." "I'm sorry. I see you now." I read them with a strange, buoyant calm. Not vindication exactly, more like alignment. The outside had finally caught up to the inside I'd been nursing back to life for years. David slid a mug across the counter and kissed my temple. "How does the truth taste?" he asked. "Like peace," I said, and meant it. I didn't spend the day replaying the applause or Richard's expression when the evidence stacked higher than his ego. I cleaned out the home office instead. I organized the last of the divorce folders into labeled bins and carried them to the garage. Not to hide them, truth doesn't get buried again in this house, but to free the space for something living. On the now empty shelves, I stacked notebooks, color swatches, and a slim folder with the title I'd dared to write only in pencil until now, Second Bloom. When I left my degree at 21, I convinced myself time had closed that door forever. But the weeks after the wedding moved with a clarity I hadn't felt in decades. I met with an advisor at the university and mapped a return online classes wrapped around my workday, one seminar on weekends. The advisor looked at my transcript, then at me. "You're not starting over," she said, "you're continuing." The word landed like a blessing. At work, the senior project manager title came with a glass-walled office and a team that looked to me for direction. The first Monday I walked in early, set a stack of portfolios on the conference table, and let silence settle before I spoke. "We're doing this a different way," I told them. "We prioritize people, not panic. We plan so thoroughly there's room to breathe." No one rolled their eyes, no one called me soft. The projects delivered early. My quiet methods, the ones Richard had once mocked, turned out to be power. At home, independence looked like small choices stacked into a life. I canceled the country club membership that still came to my name by habit and redirected the money to a scholarship fund for single parents finishing degrees. I replaced the heavy drapes Richard insisted made the house look expensive with linen that let in morning. I donated the hard-backed dining chairs he chose for their posture-correcting severity and replaced them with ones you could linger in over a second cup of coffee. I took down the last photo of our family from the peak of his career and replaced it with a picture of my son and his wife laughing at their reception, the kind of laughter that makes the future feel like sunlight. The kids noticed the difference, and so did I. My son called me between client meetings just to tell me a joke. My daughter dropped by after work with a bag of groceries and an announcement. "I signed up for the night class," she said at the threshold. "You inspired me. Architecture's not off the table just because I didn't start at 18. We cooked together saffron rice and roasted vegetables, a salad with lemon, the way her grandmother used to make it, and talked about space and light and how we're allowed to want what we want, even if we've been told otherwise. At some point, she reached across the counter and flipped my palm up. "You're different, Mom," she said, tracing the line where my wedding ring used to sit. "Not harder, brighter." On Thursdays after work, I met with the first cohort of Second Bloom, 6 women in various stages of starting over. A nurse returning to school after her own divorce. A grandmother launching a micro bakery because all her friends kept asking to buy her lemon bars. A woman whose husband had told her for 28 years she wasn't built for leadership. She practiced saying "I disagree" in the bathroom mirror and applied for a supervisor role anyway. We gathered in the community center conference room, a mismatch of chairs around a wobbly table, notebooks open, pens ready. We shared spreadsheets and strategy and quiet tears no one apologized for. We celebrated tiny victories like they were champagne moments, because they were. I stopped checking Richard's social media. At first, that felt like willpower. Eventually, it felt like indifference. The ripples from the gala kept moving without my help. He resigned from a committee he'd bragged about like a crown. A board he loved to name drop reorganized their membership. He didn't call the kids to rant. He didn't call me at all. It took me a while to recognize the shape inside that silence. It was freedom. When I finally took a weekend with David, 2 nights in a small coastal town where the wind smells like salt and eucalyptus, I packed a single duffel instead of my old just-in-case suitcase. We walked the bluff trail and ate clam chowder out of paper cups and watched a seal lift its head like a question mark in the silver water. That night, under a wool blanket, we talked about the kind of life we wanted in 10 years, a porch with morning sun, a table long enough to feed whoever shows up, a schedule with blank space on purpose. He took my hand. "I want to build a life that keeps making room for who you're becoming," he said. I tucked the sentence away where I keep the words that carry me. Back home, I started painting again. Nothing to sell, nothing to prove. Broad, messy swaths of color on canvases that leaned against the garage wall while they dried. A cardinal red like the dress I wore the night I told the world the truth. The green of the gown from the gala that made me stand tall. A thin, bright blue line that I dragged through each painting like a horizon, a reminder that even on bad days, the world holds edges that promise other sides. My therapist smiled the first time I told her about the art. "That's a victory lap," she said. "Keep running it." Some days, independence meant saying no without a paragraph of apology. "No, I'm not hosting the extended family brunch the weekend after finals. No, I won't be the one to mediate between you and Dad. No, I'm not available to fix what I didn't break." Other days it meant saying yes to parts of myself I'd neglected. Yes to a seat at the front in my seminar instead of the back row by the door. Yes to the bright red lipstick I kept in a drawer for occasions. Yes to the late afternoon nap on a Sunday just because. I even went back to the Pilates class I quit in the divorce years. The instructor cued a roll-up and my muscles remembered before my mind did. "You're strong," she said after class, not as flattery, but as a simple fact. I nodded. "I am." My relationship with David deepened not because I leaned harder on him, but because I stood more firmly on my own. We have disagreements about paint colors, budgets whose turn it is to take out the recycling, and we have a ritual I treasure when one of us reaches for control out of old habit. We name it and soften. That was my fear talking, I'll say, not my plan. He'll kiss the top of my head and say, "Let's plan then." The life we're building doesn't require anyone to shrink. Even with all the new brightness, grief had its places. Compassion didn't evaporate when courage appeared. There are days I still mourn the years I spent small. I allow it. I light a candle on the mantle and sit with the younger version of me who thought endurance was the only version of love. I tell her thank you for keeping us alive long enough to choose differently. It was on one of those candlelit evenings, the house quiet except for the steady tick of the kitchen clock, that a thin envelope arrived in the mail. No return address. My name handwritten in a tidy, careful script. It was probably a thank you note I told myself, someone from Second Bloom, a neighbor with old-fashioned manners. I set it aside and finished grading the last set of tests for my Thursday cohort budget forecast marketing draft. 3 brave sentences about fear. When I finally slit the envelope with a butter knife, a single sheet slid into my palm. No greeting, no signature. Just 5 words printed in clean black ink. "You don't know everything yet." Below the words, a photocopy of a check. The bank's watermark ghosted across the page, the date a lifetime ago, 24 years. The amount made my stomach drop. In the memo line, a single word seed. The account name wasn't Richard's, it was mine. I sat very still and stared until the numbers blurred. The check was drawn from a savings account I didn't know I'd had. The bank's branch, the small one near the grocery store that closed a decade ago. The signature my mother's. Memory flooded me then, months after our son was born, my mom handing me a spiral notebook and saying, "Just in case." Separate from Richard's business. Money your grandmother left me to tuck away for you. I remembered promising to keep it quiet so his pride wouldn't get wounded by the idea of help. And then years of babies and budgets and a man's voice louder than my own, and the notebook, the account, the promise lost under the weight of survival. The photocopy had a second page, a ledger from Richard's first year in business. Line items handwritten, deposits marked with initials. One deposit matched the check exactly. Next to it, in his deliberate, arrogant script, the word mine. My throat went dry. The room hummed with the low electric buzz that always precedes a storm. I sent a photo of the pages to David with trembling fingers. He called immediately. "You okay?" he asked. "I don't know what I am," I said. But I think the story he tells about what he built is about to crack wider than we imagined. David's voice softened. Then we followed the crack. I set the papers on the desk and retrieved the spiral notebook from the back of a drawer where I keep old letters that still matter. The first page was blank. The second held a long-ago grocery list in my mother's looping hand. On the third, a bank account number. I traced the digits with my fingertip and felt a truth larger than the gala gathering itself. Richard hadn't just lied about the middle of our life. He might have stolen the beginning. The next morning, I met with my advisor, turned in a paper on leadership and legacy, and asked if I could spend an hour in the campus archives. I requested old newspaper clippings, business registry filings, anything with Richard's company name on it. While I waited, I called the bank downtown to ask about retrieving records from a closed branch. The woman on the line was kind in the way people are when they sense you are carrying something delicate. "We'll see what we can find," she said. "Come in tomorrow, bring ID." When I left campus, I stopped by my son's office. He stood to hug me, then frowned at my expression. "What happened?" he asked. "I think I said we're about to find out who really built the beginning of that empire Dad loves to brag about." He blew out a breath and leaned against the edge of his desk. "Want me there when you go to the bank?" "Yes," I said, and didn't pretend I could do this part alone. Strength isn't isolation. It's knowing who to bring with you so you don't mistake old pain for present danger. That night, I told the second bloom women what I'd found. They didn't gasp. They didn't clutch pearls. They looked at me like women who know what it's like to discover the shape of a lie and then reach for the truth anyway. "One step at a time," said the baker. "Paper before panic," said the nurse. "You already know who you are," said the grandmother. We ate sliced oranges and brainstormed questions to ask the bank manager. I left with a list and a steadiness that felt like a hand at my back. Back home, I changed into pajamas and found David on the couch with 2 cups of tea and a look that said we're okay. I nestled under his arm and looked around at the house we have made together. On the mantel, a photo of the 4 of us on the bluff hair wild with wind. On the wall, a canvas with the thin blue line I'd started threading through everything I paint. On the table, the envelope and the copy of the check, a small storm waiting to be named. Here's the truth of independence. I wish I could send back to the version of me who sat in that restaurant on our 20th anniversary swallowing someone else's story. The point is not to become untouchable. The point is to become unrewritable. I'm not afraid of what paper will show me. I'm ready. Tomorrow we open the vault. The next morning, the bank felt colder than it should have. The kind of sterile chill that seeps into your bones, no matter how many layers you wear. My son walked beside me, his expression tight, with a protective edge I hadn't seen since he was a teenager squaring up to a bully on the playground. We met with a woman named Margaret, a senior branch manager with kind eyes that softened the formal edge of her suit. She offered us coffee and ushered us into a private office where a stack of files already waited on the desk. "I'll be honest," she said, folding her hands. "Records this old are rarely retrievable. But given the nature of your request, I asked our archivist to dig deeper, and while we found something, she slid the first folder across the desk. My son opened it, his breath catching audibly. Inside were statements from an account under my name, deposits from my grandmother's estate, transfers labeled Tuition Fund Household Emergency. But one by one they dwindled until the balance read zero. Each withdrawal bore the same signature, not mine. Richard's. The fury that surged in me was old and familiar, but this time it didn't consume me. It clarified. For decades, he had built his empire on money stolen not from strangers, but from his own wife and children. Margaret hesitated before handing over the next file. "This part," she said gently, "is harder." Inside were incorporation documents for Richard's company, articles of organization, early tax filings. And right there, in black ink, listed as an initial investor, my mother. Not Richard, not even jointly with me, just her. The check I'd received a copy of wasn't a one-time gift. It was the foundation. My mother, the woman Richard dismissed as overly sentimental, had been the one to seed his first business. She had invested in me through him, and he had erased her completely. The realization pressed down like a weight, and then strangely lifted. My entire life, Richard had lorded his success over me, over our children, as proof of his superiority. But the empire he boasted about, the legacy, he claimed it had never been his alone. It was ours. My mother's courage, my grandmother's foresight, my sacrifices. And when the documents stacked high enough, it became undeniable. "He stole it," my son said flatly, his fists curling. "He stole everything, and then had the audacity to humiliate you at my wedding." I touched his arm. "He didn't just steal, he buried, but now it's uncovered." When we left the bank, the city looked different, brighter. My son asked if I wanted to go straight home, but I shook my head. Not yet. We drove instead to the cemetery, where the winter light fell soft and silver across the gravestones. My mother's marker was simple: Grace Whitfield, beloved mother, fierce friend. I knelt, pressing my palm against the cool stone. "You gave me more than I realized," I whispered. "I thought I'd lost you twice, once when you died, and again when Richard erased you. But you were here in the foundation all along, and now I see you." A breeze stirred, rustling the dry leaves nearby. For the first time in years, I felt not grief but partnership, as though she had been waiting for me to find the trail she left behind. The next step wasn't vengeance for vengeance's sake. It was reclamation. With my lawyer's guidance, I filed for a financial review of Richard's business history. The documents from the bank became exhibits, the incorporation papers a keystone. The case wasn't criminal, too many years had passed, but it was legal enough to pierce the story Richard told the world. And when the review concluded, the truth was public record. Richard Whitfield's empire had been built on capital he neither earned nor acknowledged. His name alone no longer held the shine he polished for so long. At the next board meeting of one of his cherished charities, the chairwoman announced that Richard would be stepping down to spend more time on personal matters. The truth was, no one wanted their legacy tangled with his lies. For me, independence wasn't just emotional anymore, it was factual, documented, validated. And yet there was one more layer. 2 months after the gala, I received a call from Margaret at the bank. Her voice held a careful calm. "Mrs. Whitfield." "Well?" "Ms. Whitfield now," she corrected herself. Smiling through the line, "We found something else. A safe deposit box registered to your mother. It hasn't been accessed in over 20 years. But you're listed as an authorized party. My heart hammered. What's in it? That she said you'll need to see for yourself. The following week, I returned to the bank with my daughter. Together, we followed Margaret into the vault where she placed a small metal box on the table. My hands shook as I turned the key. Inside were a handful of papers, a velvet pouch, and a letter addressed in my mother's unmistakable handwriting. For Eleanor, when you are ready. I unfolded the letter slowly. My darling girl, it began. If you're reading this, it means Richard has done what I feared he might taken what was meant for you and claimed it as his own. But I want you to know I trusted you then and I trust you now. The money I gave was never for him. It was for you to build the life you wanted. If he used it to start his business, then remember, this every brick he laid was on the back of your inheritance. Don't let him make you feel small. You are the true foundation, and one day you'll see it too. My vision blurred with tears, but I kept reading. The pouch contains what remains of your grandmother's heirloom. It isn't much, but it's a reminder. Legacy is not in money or power, it's in truth, and truth, Eleanor, is yours. I opened the pouch. Inside was a locket, delicate and old, etched with our family crest. I placed it in my daughter's palm. It's yours now, I whispered, from the women who came before us. She clutched it tightly, tears shining in her eyes. Mom, she believed in you even when you didn't. Yes, I said softly, and now I believe in me too. Richard tried to reach out once after the documents became public. He called his voice low, almost pleading. You've ruined me, he said. Do you feel proud? I answered with a calm I hadn't known I possessed. No, Richard, you ruined yourself. I just stopped covering it up. And I hung up. The silence after was not heavy, it was clean. Months later, standing in the sunlit conference room with the latest Second Bloom group, I told them pieces of the story. Not all of it, the wounds, the betrayal, the specifics of Richard's downfall. Just the truth that mattered, that strength is not the absence of betrayal, but the decision to write your own ending anyway. One woman raised her hand. But what if they've taken everything she asked? I smiled. Then you know what I learned, they can never take you. And sometimes when you dig deep enough, you'll find the very foundation they bragged about was yours all along. As I drove home that night, the locket around my daughter's neck still vivid in my memory, I realized something. Revenge hadn't been about humiliating Richard. It had been about reclaiming the truth, my family's truth. The twist wasn't just discovering his theft. It was discovering that all along I hadn't been living in his shadow. He had been living off my light. And now that light was mine again.